Okay, so Wittgenstein's uncertainty. So when we talk about Wittgensteinian epistemology, we have in mind, I mean, lots of things Wittgenstein said are relevant to epistemology, but the kind of things Martin and myself are interested in is what crops up in his final notebooks, which are published as uncertainty. Now, a few things to bear in mind. These were it's 4 notebooks. They go right up to his death. In fact, the last entry is about 2 days. I think it's 2 days before he dies. They're unedited by him. They're impressionistic. It's probably not a good idea to try and get a canonical reading of them, although people will try. I mean, there's a certain branch of Wittgensteinism. They congregate every year in Kirchberg, and I recommend if you ever get the chance to go there to one of their congresses, and you'll see the radical wing of Wittgensteinians who think that, you know, this is kind of like divine scripture, basically. You know, Wittgenstein was never confused about everything. Everything is clear. If you just understand what he said, then we'll get to the truth. I think it's always unwise to do that with any philosopher. It's particularly unwise with unedited notebooks like this. You know, I think actually they're extremely interesting. I mean, not just philosophically, but just from a historical point of view, to see someone wrestling with ideas like that and jumping backwards and forwards and seeing the thought processes in play. And they're also very interesting just because they take us right up to before he dies. And there's some very poignant remarks there. At one point he says, you know, I feel like I'm not going to get to I can't get to the beginning of things. I guess I never will. A few other things to say about the text. There's sort of like an official view as to what inspires it, which is, I think, partly correct, but it is perhaps misleading to some extent. You get this from the preface, which is written by von Richt and Anscombe. And this is the idea, which I say is partly true, that the stimulus is Moore's comments on idealism and skepticism. And in particular, Wittgenstein was coming to this through his conversation with Malcolm. He'd recently been to Ithaca, to Cornell, to speak with Malcolm about this. As I said, it's partly right. I think there's another stimulus to uncertainty which gets ignored, I'm going to come to later, which I think is very important when we think about this work in the context of epistemic relativism. The other problem with this is that, thinking of the text in this way, is that it obscures an important difference between the philosophical challenge posed by idealism and that challenge posed by skepticism. And I think Wittgenstein was alert to the distinction. I think a lot of commentators on uncertainty aren't so alert to it creates problems. Another issue you might want to bear in mind here is whether or not there's a new idea in uncertainty, or whether this is just, you know, it's just an extension of ideas you can find in other works like Investigations. I think for a long time uncertainty wasn't given a very central place, but, you know, in terms of people studying it, that's because they thought it was just the same themes cropping up that you get in Investigations. But I'm of the view that there really is a new train of thought in there, a new idea. So even though it's not a canonical reading, I think there is a distinct train of thought which doesn't appear earlier, which is very novel and which is quite important. And I think it's that idea which gives rise to this discussion of the Wittgensteinian epistemology. Okay, so let's say a few things about Moore. This is going to be a very crude rendering of Moore. There's basically 2 papers of Moore which are salient here, and there's a bunch of things which Moore wrote in his general vicinity, but the 2 famous papers, the earlier paper, A Defence of Common Sense, 1925, where he enumerates these certainties, these more, we these days called Moorean certainties, these things which we're optimally certain of, which have a certain unshakable quality to them. The kinds of things, if we're wrong about this, we're wrong about just about everything, like I've got 2 hands, I've got parents, I've never been to the moon, I'm speaking English, and so forth. There's also his later paper, which is more famous, which is The Proof of an External World, published in 1939. I think that's a very misunderstood paper. This is the paper where famously he said, you know, he's proving external world at 1 hand, 2 hand physical object, therefore the external world. The paper gets caricatured. It's actually a very subtle paper if you read it. The caricature of the paper and what the paper actually says is very different. Moore, in fact, in that paper is trying to tell us something he says is important about proofs. But there's a certain style of argument that crops up, and it's, ignoring some complications here, it's roughly the idea that there are these common sense certainties and that they can play a certain kind of unusual foundational epistemic role. They can be, as it were, unmoved movers in the epistemic architecture, where they're rational stopping points where we can push back against varieties of skepticism or philosophical revisionism. So, skepticism is the kinds of philosophical revisionism we have in mind, things like idealism. Right? So, in the proof we have this idea that the philosopher comes along and gives us an argument for idealism, and then according to the argument, I don't know that I've got two hands where a hand's a physical object. But we can mount a resistance to that by saying, well, it's a common sense certainty that I've got two hands, and from that basis I can infer that this philosophical claim is false. Now, the rough idea is something like this, that where you've got, as it were, an impasse, a philosophical claim pushing you one direction, common sense view pushing the other. If it is simply an impasse, as it were, common sense wins a draw. That's the idea, in a nutshell. Certainly as it comes out in the proof. So, Moore never puts it in these terms, but to put it in more contemporary terms. Suppose we granted that everyday knowledge, insofar as we've got everyday knowledge, we must know the Giles and skeptical hypotheses, because we can recognise that they're incompatible. So if I've got hands, there can't be a handless brain with that. Well, the sceptic will say, well, obviously you don't know the consequence, you don't know the antecedent. There's a anti-skeptical view which will say, well, we do know the antecedent, and then tries to give a story about how we know the consequence. The Moorean view will be, well, okay, maybe I can't tell you how I know the consequence. Right? But I don't have to. All I need to do is to highlight the fact that the antecedent is this article of common sense, and that it's confronting a theoretical claim which is less certain than this article of common sense. That by itself gives me enough purchase on the issue to motivate the anti-skeptical conclusion. And that's a very distinctive Moorean kind of argument. Even if you can't explain how it is you know the Giles and skeptical hypotheses, you're entitled to think that you do. That's a very simplistic way of reading Moore, particularly the Moore of the proof. Because as I said, in the proof, Moore's interested in, he wants to make points about what constitutes a proof, which we don't really want to get into. Also, putting it this way, it glides over that distinction I made earlier between skepticism and idealism. They're both targets here. But one is a philosophical position, the other one purports, at any rate, to be a paradox. And what I mean by that is a paradox is like a tension that arises within our own concepts. It's not a position that anyone's advocating, although we can think of it in those terms. We can think that there's a skeptic, and the skeptic is arguing for a position. But really, skepticism in its strongest form is a tension in our own concepts. We can just think through the problem just in our own heads and realise that we have various commitments, but they can't all stand, they generate contradiction. And that's why the Moorean response, I think, to idealism has some plausibility, because you might think, well, look, if common sense confronts theory, then ceteris paribus, common sense ought to win. When it comes to skepticism, it doesn't really give us any purchase, because, as it were, it doesn't tell us how to resolve the contradiction. We're still faced with the conflict within our own concepts, so how do we resolve them? In any case, what's relevant here is this idea that Moore's offering a very distinctive kind of foundationalism. So it's different from a classical foundationalism. On a classical foundationalist view, you have these sort of epistemic unmoved movers, which have very special kind of epistemic properties. Infallibly known, corrigible, self-evident, or something like that. They tend to be quite theoretical claims. I think the cogito is a very good example of this, or at the very least they're mundane claims which are given some sort of philosophical hedging. So I can be wrong about where P is like some proposition about the world, I can be wrong about that, but I can't be wrong about whether or not it seems to me that P, or my argument goes. So that has a special epistemic status. Moore, though, wants to say that these common sense certainties, in virtue of being these common sense certainties, they can play this special role, not because obviously they don't have these kind of epistemic properties attached to them. It's just in virtue of being optimally certain. They're playing that role in our common sense picture. And it's this idea that interested Wittgenstein. So what's this idea that I think that I claim and others have claimed is distinctive to uncertainty? Well, it's a claim, as I expressed it in terms of the structure, a claim about structure of reasons, or if you like, the structure of rational evaluation is probably a more accurate way of putting it. So Wittgenstein certainly was intrigued by this thought that these everyday certainties can play some kind of special epistemic role. But unlike Moore, he wanted to invert the picture in play here. The thought was that in virtue of them being optimally certain, they must therefore be groundless. And what So whereas Moore had this idea that they have special epistemic status in virtue of being optimally certain, Wittgenstein wants to say, well, no. In virtue of playing this role, they have no epistemic status at all. So the thought is that we're required, any belief system at all has to have these optimal certainties within it. But that in virtue of them playing that role of being optimal certainties, they cannot be the kinds of things that can be rationally evaluated, whether negatively, rationally doubted, or positively, given rational support. Now I'm going to give you a bunch of quotes in a minute, but let me just talk through the idea, because there's various parts to it, and in my experience there's no easy way to get all the parts on the table, so I'm just going to run through them. Some more points. So we've covered the first one. Yeah, so various remarks Wittgenstein tries to get us to see that we can't rationally doubt the hinge propositions, the common sense certainties, we haven't got to the hinges yet. So the Moorean proposition, these common sense certainties, given that they are optimally certain, time and again he makes this point, well look, insofar as reasons for doubt crop up as regards these common sense certainties, it's always going to be more reasonable for us to doubt the reasons for doubt than to doubt the thing which is being put under examination. What's interesting though, anti-skeptics since time immemorial have made this point. Wittgenstein wants to say that there's a parallel, it follows from this as a parallel point about epistemic support. But by the same token that we can't think of these Moorean propositions as being in the market for rational doubt, we can't think of them as having rational support either. It makes no sense when it's optimally certain to have rational support which is going to be less certain than the proposition in question. And then there's another key point. Wittgenstein wants to, again and again, tries to emphasize that it's not just a peculiar feature of our epistemic practices that we have these certainties. It's not as if it's just an oddity of how we as rational subjects have developed. It's in the very nature of what it is to be a rational subject that these certainties are in play. I'll use some quotations to illustrate this. Okay, suppose you grant all that. We haven't had the quotations yet. Just grant that general framework for a moment. Various things follow. One thing that follows is that you get a picture of the structure of rational evaluation which is essentially local. So, Wittgenstein's idea is that both the skeptic and the traditional anti-skeptic, like the Moorean, they're both trying to engage in a certain kind of project which involves fully general rational evaluations. So evaluating all your beliefs at once. And a good example of this is Descartes. He's in his woodshed or whatever. And the thought is he can abstract himself from everyday life to such an extent that he can, as he says, tip the barrel of apples over. And, this is the metaphor is his beliefs. Instead of examining them piecemeal, he can examine them all universally. And the thought is that when someone conducts an evaluation like that, the idea is they're not doing anything essentially different to the kinds of evaluations we make in ordinary life. I mean, it's just a difference of scope. So it's a kind of harmless shift here from these local rational evaluations to these fully general ones. Wittgenstein wants to say, no, something's gone wrong. These fully general rational evaluations are simply incoherent because fully general rational evaluation would, of course, take in the hinges, take in the Moorean propositions, and of course they aren't subject to rational evaluation. It's really important, though, to see that this is both an anti-skeptical and a skeptical point, oddly. So it's not just that the skeptic can't undertake a fully general rational evaluation. The anti-skeptic can't do it either. You can't make it a negative one or a positive one. So the skeptic wants to undertake a fully general rational evaluation which is negative. The anti-skeptic, the Moorean, wants to make a fully general rational evaluation which is positive. Wittgenstein's idea is that they're both incoherent. He also has this story to tell about how these certainties aren't acquired by rational processes, they're not taught, they're rather swallowed down in what we're taught. No one teaches you that you've got two hands. They teach you how to do things with your hands. That you've got two hands is something that's swallowed down with the things that you are taught. And they're not subject to rational evaluation. They, as he puts it, they lie apart from the route travelled by inquiry. It actually takes a very perverse kind of inquiry, that is philosophy, to bring them into any kind of consideration at all. Any normal inquiry, they just don't come up. Or if they do come up, it's for mundane empirical reasons. So the claim you've got two hands, of course, that's a Moorean certainty in normal circumstances. Obviously, if you're stumbling from the wreckage of a car, from a car accident or whatever, or you just had a major surgery on your hands, then it won't be a Moorean certainty. But that's fine. That's just mundane ways in which they can it's no longer a Morean proposition in this case. It's only in the special circumstances that it is. So he's ruling out positive and negative wholesale rational evaluations of our beliefs. So it's both the skepticism, radical skepticism is problematic, or buys into a problematic picture of rational evaluation, and the traditional anti-skeptic. Neither is possible on Wittgenstein's view. And then there's this famous remark, hence we must learn to recognise the ultimate grounds of our belief. Right, give me some quotes. My having two hands is, in normal circumstances, as certain as anything I can produce in evidence for it. That's why I'm not in a position to take the sight of my hands as evidence for it. What he's trying to alert us to here is the oddity of, we take I have two hands in normal circumstances being more in a proposition. But by the same token then, it's odd to think of you're seeing your hands as being a ground for believing that you've got two hands. If a blind man were to ask me if you've got two hands, I should not make sure by looking. I mean, I think that's a very perceptive remark. Someone says you've got two hands, oh, I don't know, I'll look. That's not how it goes. Right? It's like the old Morecambe and Wise sketch where once, I think it's Morecambe and Wise, once says do you know how to play piano? I don't know, I've never tried. Let's find out. Then no, you don't. If I were to have any doubt of it, then I don't know why I should trust my eyes. Well, why shouldn't I test my eyes by looking to find out whether I see my two hands? What is to be tested by what? So the thought is, these Morean certainties have to be in place in order for rational evaluation to take place. They are the background relative to which things count as reason for or against other things. If you try to doubt everything, you would not get as far as doubting anything. The game of doubting itself presupposes certainty. And I think he could just as well have said, well, he doesn't actually say this, but it's implicit in lots of other things, he says the game of believing presupposes certainty. What he wants to emphasise is that what it is to get oneself into a position where one is able to offer reasons for and against proposition, to play the game of reasons, one has to have the certainties in place. Again, he's emphasising the fact they're not optional. Right? It's not as if things could have been otherwise. It's not as if we were more rigorous, had more imagination, were cleverer and so on, then we wouldn't have hinge commitments, but we'd have fully grounded rational beliefs. That simply isn't possible. And then we get the famous quotation, now I can start talking about hinges. It's now Wittgenstein mentions, gives us the metaphor. The questions that we raise our doubts depend upon the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, or as it were, like hinges on which they stand. That is to say, it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations that certain things are indeed not doubted. But isn't the situations like this? We just can't investigate everything, and for that reason we are forced to rest content with assumption. If I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. A few things to say here. The hinge metaphor has been very influential, and I'm going to use it from now on. But as we'll see at the end, especially in the context of epistemic relativism, it may not be the best metaphor to use here. And Wittgenstein uses other metaphors, as we'll see at the end, the bedrock propositions. Other things to say. So notice this point here, that just at the bottom of this quotation, about how it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations. We just can't investigate everything. It's not that we just can't investigate everything, we have to rest content with assumption. This is a really key point. It's not just that it's an incidental limitation on our rational practices that be like this. Wittgenstein says, no, it's in the very nature of rational evaluation that it's local in this way. That's the very nature of rational evaluation. It just could not be, as the skeptic and the traditional anti-skeptic supposes. They're both buying into a faulty picture about what rational evaluation could be. So that's the claim, that's the big idea in Wittgenstein's uncertainty. This idea that rational evaluation is essentially local, and that it could not be otherwise. I think a good way of bringing out why this is so important is to compare Wittgenstein and Austin on this. So Austin, in his famous paper of the Minds, makes, on the surface of things, some very similar moves to Wittgenstein. He emphasises again and again the locality of our normal practices of rational evaluation, how that's very different from sceptical and philosophical rational evaluations, which tend to have a far greater scope. And here's a famous remark. Enough is enough, it doesn't mean everything. Enough means enough to show that within reason and present intensive purposes, it can't be anything. So he's talking about whether or not you know this thing before he's a goldfinch. There's no room for alternative competing description of it. It does not mean, for example, enough to show it isn't a stuffed goldfinch. Note the similarities between what Austin's up to and Wittgenstein. They're both emphasising this locality of rational support, how it's different from sceptical and philosophical ways of undertaking rational evaluations, which are fully general. But there's also a crucial difference. And this is brought out quite neatly in an objection that Stroud makes in his wonderful book, The Significance of Philosophical Skepticism, which appeared in the 80s. So Stroud pretty much single-handedly resurrected the skeptical problem. And he did this by going through lots of anti-skeptical moves and showing why they're problematic. In the case of the sort of ordinary language type moves that you get in people like Austin, his objection was that Austin trades far too much on the idea that there's a difference between everyday epistemic practices and skeptical epistemic practices. And they try and conclude from that, on that basis alone, that there's something dubious about the skeptical epistemic practices. But Stroud says, well, no. A plausible, a clever version of radical skepticism, quite a paradox. They're going to grant, well, of course, our ordinary practices are very different. Our ordinary epistemic practices of rational evaluation. And they'll say, but there's good reasons for that. It's because in ordinary context, we're constrained in certain ways. There are limitations on us. Limitations to imagination, opportunity, time, and so forth. Nonetheless, the skeptical epistemic practices, they are, as it were, ordinary practices which are purified. They're purified versions of those ordinary practices. Strip away all the incidental factors, and then what you're left with is the skeptical system of epistemic evaluation. So it's not enough to point to the differences between the two. You've got to show there's a discontinuity. And Austin never does that. Wittgenstein, though, does. I mean, this is what Wittgenstein's up to. It's consistent with Austin's approach of sort of a difference of degree between the two ways of conducting rational evaluation. Wittgenstein says time and again, no, it's not just a difference of degree, it's a difference of kind. Something very completely different is being attempted when the skeptic undertakes their fully general rational evaluation, or when the anti-skeptic undertakes their fully general positive rational evaluation. They're trying to do something which simply cannot be done, which buys into this incoherent picture about the structure of reasons. Okay, now I know I haven't said much about epistemic relativism yet, but we need to talk a bit about skepticism to get to the relativism. So I think Moore was convinced of this idea. So Wittgenstein was convinced of this idea. But of course, as always, the devil is in the detail. How to develop it in such a way that it's a coherent idea. And there's two problems that Wittgenstein struggles with in the notebooks. One is skepticism. How does this respond to, I mean, in one sense, the response to skepticism is also a response to anti-skepticism, like more. But how is it different ultimately from skepticism? Because, ultimately it is saying our believing is groundless, things of which we're most convinced of lack a rational basis. That sounds very much like radical skepticism, and yet, in some sense, meant to be the antidote to radical skepticism. I'm going to give you one way of bringing out the worry here in a moment. And the other is epistemic relativism. If there are these hinge commitments, then why isn't it possible for there to be people with very different hinge commitments? So they have very different systems of rational evaluation. What they count as a reason for what is radically different. Why won't that lead to a pernicious form of epistemic relativism? So as I explained in a moment, it's not clear to me all forms of epistemic relativism are by their nature to be avoided, but there are certainly some forms that are highly problematic, the more radical forms. And I think it's the more radical forms that Wittgenstein was concerned with. So, as I said, there's two issues there, skepticism and epistemic relativism. They kind of intersect in interesting ways. Here's a way of bringing out the skeptical worry, and which crops up in Wittgenstein himself. So, the thought is that we have these hinge propositions, these hinge commitments. They're essentially groundless. And then, if this is an anti-skeptical view, or if it's a view that's doesn't just collapse in skepticism, consistent with that, our other beliefs ought to be rationally held. So the thought is, generally speaking, our beliefs are rationally held, but then there are these framework propositions, these hinge propositions, which aren't. But now the problem emerges, what if non-hinge beliefs stand in relevant logical relations with the hinge commitments? So take this case. I'm an historian, let's say. I conduct an inquiry historical inquiry about the Battle of Austerlitz. And so I discover certain facts. There's nothing hinge-like going on here. These aren't optimal certainties in any way. It's just a normal kind of inquiry which offers grounds in the usual sorts of ways. So you discover that, it's 1805, is it, thereabouts? So you discover that 1805 such and such happened, which is after the Battle of Ostend. Now suppose you then notice, well look, if such and such happened just after the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, well then the universe didn't, it follows the universe didn't come into existence 5 seconds ago, replete with the traces of a distant ancestry. I mean, the one entails the other. But presumably, the latter is a hinge commitment. It's the kind of thing that is optimally certain for us. It's not the kind of thing that we have grounds for on Wittgenstein's view. But how does the one square with the other? How can I have grounds for believing an historical claim? How can I then know that the historical claim entails a claim about the reality of the past, which is a hinge claim, and yet not have a rational basis for endorsing the hinge claim? What's in play here is a kind of what's called a closure principle. If you've got rationally grounded knowledge, and then you undertake a competent deduction, and form belief on that basis, well then, it seems what results is itself rationally grounded knowledge. How could it not be? I mean, competent deductions are paradigm cases of the transmission of rational grounds, right? It's a paradigm case of a rational process. So how could you have anything that's less rationally grounded or not rationally grounded coming out as an output at the end of such a process? But with that principle in play, well then it seems if your non-hinge beliefs, which are rationally grounded, stand in entailment relations to your hinge commitments, well then either you have to say the hinge commitments are rationally grounded, well that destroys the view, or you have to go the other way, you have to say that none of your beliefs, or none of the beliefs that have these standing entailment relation anyway, are rationally grounded. And now you're back at skepticism. I don't think Wittgenstein really worked out what he wanted to say about this. Fair enough, I mean, he didn't have much time, right? But I think this is a problem that vexed him. I think there is a way out of it, though, as I'll explain in a moment. And it depends very much on how one thinks about the hinge commitments. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just mentioned how do people develop, how do people respond to this problem and in the same light develop Wittgensteinian epistemology and literature? Well, you could deny closure. I mean, when people deny closure, though, the literature like Dritzker and Nozick, they're actually denying a much cruder version of the principle than the one I just put up. The one I just put up is this diachronic principle. And I think that principle usually is regarded as pretty secure. Weaker versions might be contestable, but the thought is if you want to get out of the problem, you can't just deny closure in the weaker form, you have to deny that stronger form. It's quite hard to do. Another route you might take is you could be a kind of radical epistemic externalist. I had a go at this years ago. I don't think it was altogether successful. But so the thought is, well, look, if you're an externalist, you think, well, sometimes at least knowledge needn't be rationally grounded. So maybe our epistemic argument is that we may have lots of knowledge, depending on whether the world obliges in certain ways, but that we don't have very much, perhaps any, rationally grounded knowledge. The problem with this is it ends up being quite an implausible position, because plausible versions of epistemic externalism, they want to say that some knowledge lacks a rational basis, but they don't want to say that all knowledge or most knowledge lacks a rational basis. It ends up being quite revisionary. And indeed, if one ends up with that sort of view, I think you end up with a view which is kind of indistinguishable from skepticism. Because I think skepticism fundamentally isn't really attacking whether or not we have beliefs with a certain external epistemic status. I mean, maybe not. The skeptic wants to say, yeah, but do you have a rational basis for what you believe? And if you say, well, no, generally speaking, no, I think that's to concede to the skeptic. Crispin Wright has this idea of entitlements. I'm not going to go into this. I might mention it later on. I just mentioned it because it is a view out there. I think it just unravels very quickly. But it's just a way of trying to say that you might have there might be a rational basis to believe hinges, which aren't rational basis to believe them to be true. So you have to do this kind of balancing act, where there could be a reason to believe something which isn't a reason to believe it to be true. An epistemic reason to believe it, which isn't a reason to believe it to be true. And this Wright tries to somehow steer a line with it here. And I don't think it works, but we'll talk about it. What's more interesting for our purposes is contextualism, as Williams understands it, Michael Williams. This is different from, a lot of people know the sort of attributive style of contextualism you get with DeRose, Lewis, David Lewis. This is a different kind of view which predates that. I mean, it overlaps in some ways too. It's the idea that, well, when you embrace the Wittgensteinian picture, you also embrace the idea, well, different contexts have different hinges. So, I mean, the way Williams thinks of hinges, they can be disciplinary, for example. Like when you're doing history, the reality of the past is one of the hinges. When you're doing philosophy, other hinges might come into play, but maybe not the reality of the past now, because now you can start asking about the reality of the past. If you start asking about the reality of the past when you're doing history, well, that's not to do history in a more rigorous fashion. That's to do something completely different. So you get a kind of contextual. So the thought is that when these inferences take place in the closure principle, where you shift from the non-hinge claim to the hinge claim, a context shift is going on. So, prior to the context shift, you did have rationally grounded knowledge of the historical claim, and then when you undertake the inference, you jump out of one context into another. And now it's also true that you lack knowledge of the reality of the past. But that's because there's been a context shift. This view, by the way, which I'm going to come back to, I think if you think of hinges this way, you're going to end up with the pernicious form of epistemic relativism. So this is how these two debates about Wittgensteinian epistemology and skepticism connects with Wittgensteinian epistemology and epistemic relativism. And then we've got two other readings. There's my own view about hinges, which, I say older and wiser, I suppose that's for you to decide, isn't it, really, rather than myself. I call it the non-belief reading. There's a more radical view, which is the non-propositional reading of hinges, which you find in, Moyal Shirok is the principal exponent of this view. This may well be the view that has the most support from the text, actually. And certainly if you want to see uncertainty as being continuous in various ways with investigations, then I think this is the way to go. It has a lot of baggage though, philosophical baggage. It's the idea that really hinge proposition is a misnomer. There's no proposition being picked out at all. Wittgenstein does say things to support this in uncertainty. Quite a complication though, right? So as I said at the beginning, uncertainty is 4 notebooks. The first notebook, which takes up to about section 65. Wittgenstein's primary target there is Moore's proof. And because of that, his primary target is idealism. And Wittgenstein's view about idealism is very clear, that statements like there is an external world, there are physical objects, are just nonsense. It looks like something contentful happening, but it hasn't. You haven't picked out anything. It's just a mistake. It's just the appearance of content. You've got a bunch of words, which we use them all the time, very familiar settings. Now you've plugged them into another setting, and you've got the appearance of meaning, but actually you've said nothing meaningful. So here the non-propositional reading gets a purchase, but it only gets a purchase because we're not talking about these Morean certainties, we're talking about very theoretical claims. There is an external world. The next 3 notebooks though, the focus shifts. And Wittgenstein's focus becomes more on the Morean certainties, like, I've got 2 hands, and so on. At times, Wittgenstein does say things suggest that even here he might think that there's no proposition expressed. At one point he has someone stating a Morean certainty, and he says it's a bit like saying good morning in the middle of a conversation. But of course, it's much harder to think of these kind of Morean claims as lacking a content, right? It seems the idea that I don't believe that I've got 2 hands right now seems an odd claim. But in any case, they try. I think if you really wanted to motivate this, what you'd have to do is ally, which these people don't do, is ally the view to a kind of very radical Travis-style view about content. I think that would be the way to develop it. You put the two together, and I think you've probably got something which could make sense of this reading. I prefer one with a bit. My view has a lot less philosophical baggage, and one of the advantages I think of my view is that you can. Lots of people like this basic idea of Wittgenstein about the structure of rational evaluation, but they don't like all the extra stuff that goes with it. So what I like about this proposal, I suppose, especially to this one, but also for that one, maybe even this one too, is that you don't have to buy into much else that's implausible. Insofar as you buy the basic idea, then you don't need much else. Okay, so how does this connect with epistemic relativism? So I said that Wittgenstein was troubled by this. It comes out time and again in the text. His concern for this problem, and often it crops up in a religious context. Missionaries, going into foreign cultures and things like that. So you've got where two principles really do meet, which cannot reconcile with another, then each man declares the other a fool and heretic. I would say combat the other man, but wouldn't he give him reasons? Certainly, but how far do they go? At the end of reasons comes persuasion. Think of what happens when missionaries convert natives. The relativism play here, notice, it's not about truth, or at least I think to keep things simple, let's just stipulate it's not about truth, and it's not about meaning either. So we're imagining disagreements where each side thinks there's an objective fact of the matter, one of them's right, one of them's wrong, and that they are really communicating one another. It's not that they're just speaking past one another. What Wittgenstein is trying to capture is the thought that even if those conditions are met, if we grant this idea of local rational evaluations relative to hinge commitments, what if the hinge commitments are radically different? Could it then follow that there's no rational way of resolving disagreements? Yeah. So two parties can disagree to such an extent, so the hinge proposition is different to such an extent that they both believe rationally by their lights, but there is no rational way of resolving the disagreement because of the existence of the hinge commitment. And this is what I think when I talk about the pernicious kind of epistemic relativism. The mere possibility of there being different epistemic systems needn't be pernicious, because you can imagine them being overlapping. Maybe they overlap in fundamental ways. And then there wouldn't be epistemic incommensurability then, or needn't be. It's only when you have like a radical alienation between the two that you get the pernicious form. In fact, it may even be that we could live with some possibility of epistemic incommensurability, just as long as it wasn't too widespread. It wasn't too modally close, as it were. Because then it maybe wouldn't be so practically troublesome. I mean, I take it, when we think in the context of philosophy of science of epistemic relativism getting grip, we think of it as getting a grip in actual concrete cases. So we might look back historically at certain debates that have taken place and conceive them as represent them as being in terms of clashes of epistemic context, epistemic worldview systems. Now, one thing that I think is very important to mention here is the influence of John Henry Newman on Wittgenstein, and particularly an essay on the grammar of assent. So I said earlier that the standard line has it that Wittgenstein, the stimulation for uncertainty was more via Malcolm. But it seems pretty clear to me that actually there's even more stimulus coming from Newman. Cardinal Newman, as he later became, and then soon to be beautified. I don't know, I guess he wouldn't say Newman, but he's saying something. Newman was this incredibly dominant intellectual figure at the time. I mean, if you go back to the interwar period and just look up some collections of philosophy, all the big names are in there, and they're all talking about Newman. Newman was the kind of thing where everyone read Newman, everyone had a view about Newman. Newman had the kind of influence that Wittgenstein would have post-war. It's an odd thing, an odd sociological fact, I think, about philosophy, that Newman just disappeared, almost. So this huge dominant figure. And then, I mean, in other areas of divinity, he's still a very dominant figure, but not in philosophy. And yet, his philosophical writings are very interesting. They certainly influence, I mean, there's no doubt that they influence more. The issue really is just the extent to which they influence him. What you find in an essay in Edinburgh Grammar of Assent is essentially this idea about structure of rational evaluation that you get in uncertainty. Newman makes all the same moves. The Morean certainties, I mean, obviously he doesn't call them that, but he appeals to them again and again. Some of the examples are common to both texts. So Newman uses the example, for example, that I have parents. Some of the examples are a bit odd, things like Great Britain as an island, so quite parochial sort of examples. But he has these ideas of things which, if I'm wrong about this, I'm radically adrift. What's interesting about Newman, though, is that he wants to do this in the service of defending the rationality of religious belief. He advances an early form, what we now call, philosophers of religion call a parity argument. So, parity arguments, which contemporary literature popularised by Austen and Plantinga and people like that. The basic strategy is to say, well, look, here's a type of belief that everyone thinks is fine. Religious belief is just like that kind of belief. So, if you want to be down on religious belief, you've got to be down on either got to say religious belief is okay, or you've got to be down on this kind of belief as well. So, in the case of Austen and Plantinga, for example, perceptual belief is the way they proceed. They say religious belief is plausibly has similar epistemic features to perceptual belief. Certainly if you think that there's a religious faculty, at work in the formation of religious belief. Newman's line, though, is that it's more general than that. It's that, look, he says, well, look, it's true that religious belief has these basic certainties which aren't rationally grounded, which are subject to what he calls simple assent. But he says that can't be a strike against religious belief because all belief, religious or otherwise, has these basic certainties and which aren't rationally evaluated. And a famous quotation I gave at the beginning says, none of us can think or act without the acceptance of truth. It's not intuitive, not demonstrated, etc. And this is essentially the hinge idea. I mean, I think it's very telling here how Newman responds to Hume on miracles. And as far as I know, it's one of these things where I don't think anyone's really discussed this, but it's a really fascinating discussion in there of Hume and miracles. First off, he gets Hume right. Lots of people don't. I mean, lots of people don't get Hume right now, but probably then, even more people didn't get him right. So Hume isn't saying that miracles are impossible events. No, he defines them anyway. He's not saying that it's not possible to have rational belief in a miracle. He's not saying that all testimonial belief has to have an independent rational basis. So it's not a global reductionist, for example. Some people allege. Hume's point is actually very specific. It's that if your only reason for believing in a miracle is testimonial, then that's not a good reason. And that's it. So if you're going to have a rational belief in a miracle, you need an independent rational basis. That's the point he's making. Very specific. Newman states that, and bear in mind he's defending the rationality of religious belief, he endorses it. Completely striking move. Most people who want to defend religious belief in response to Hume's claim about miracles, they either go fideistic, so you remove religious belief from the arena of rational evaluation altogether, or you go evidentialist in the sort of Lockean fashion. You say, well, yeah, there are independent reasons. Here are all these independent reasons for believing God exists and the miracles occur and so forth. Or you can dispute the Humean principle. You go Reedian or something like that. No, Newman says no. Hume's absolutely wrong. But what that shows, he says, is that the rational religious believer's conviction in the existence of miracles, it's not based on testimony. I mean, it might causally be produced by testimony, but that's not its basis. It's what we're thinking of as a hinge commitment. Yeah, so this isn't fideistic narratives, because the idea is that religious beliefs in general may well be rationally held. It's just that some of them, just like any other kind of belief system, will be. Now, as I say, I think there's a lot of textual evidence to think that Newman had this incredible influence on uncertainty. I mean, bear in mind he's dying. We know he almost certainly converted to Catholicism before he died, perhaps on his deathbed. He was consulting with Catholic priests and so on. Newman is the dominant intellectual figure at the time, so on, who renounced Church of England after Catholicism. It just all fits, you know. The hinge metaphor is the hinge, maybe not the exact metaphor of the hinge, but lots of the metaphors that Wittgenstein uses as examples crop up again and again. But if that's the context in which Wittgenstein is coming to this, you can see how the threat of epistemic relativism is going to have such a pull on him. Because he's thinking now of clashes of hinge commitments which could be quite radical. You know, the world of someone, the epistemic system employed by someone who has a religious worldview may be very different in terms of hinge commitments on to someone who doesn't. Okay, so now we get to the question. To what extent then does this view about hinges, about structural rational evaluation, to what extent does it license epistemic relativism, at least the pernicious version? I think it depends very much on how one understands hinge commitments. And I think there's a bit of a decision point here. Fortunately, although I think the standard way of thinking about hinge commitments drives us towards the epistemic relativism view, I think really what Wittgenstein ends up with, and which I think is the right way of thinking about hinge commitments, if you're going to go down this route, doesn't generate this problem, or doesn't generate in quite a serious form. And I think a good way, a point of comparison here is Williams' view versus my own. So Williams thinks of the hinges as he calls them methodological necessities. As I mentioned a moment ago, he thinks they're very much optional. They can shift with disciplinary factors. They can involve common sense claims, and they can also involve quite theoretical claims. You know, it could be when one does physics, one accepts these things. When one does history, one accepts these things. When one does literary theory, one accepts these things. And he also is quite happy with the idea that whether or not an epistemic system is knowledge generating, I mean, that just depends really on whether or not the hinges are true. There's not any other constraint element of that. So, I mean, he even goes as far as say, look, and I think this is a mistake actually, he says, look, there's a skeptical context. And in the skeptical context, well, it's true we don't have knowledge is impossible. But this conclusion lacks generality because it's only relative to the hinges of the skeptical context. The hinges being something like universal rational evaluation is possible, or something like that. If you think about it, though, that's actually just a mistake on Wittgenstein's part because the hinges have to be true. Like, by his lights, the hinge in that case is false. So actually, the skeptical context is not going to find it. But generally speaking, so long as the hinges are true, then the skeptical context can be knowledge generated. I think if you have that kind of view of the hinge commitments, then it's very natural to think, well, you can have people with hugely variant, therefore different hinge commitments. And if that's possible, you can have epistemic commensurability, and you've got the finishes around epistemic relativism. There's a paper which I give at the end here, I give a bunch of literature, chase this up if you want, where, I'm a big fan of Williams, by the way, but this paper, Williams tries to show that his view doesn't lead to epistemic relativism, and it just, I have a paper which is effectively a response, and it just doesn't work. I mean, in the end, he ends up by the end conceding the very thing that he started off saying he didn't want to concede. It's very clear if you close reading. And the problem just emerged from the fact that this view of hinge commitments is committed to. And in fact, many people are committed to, not just Williams. And I think that people feel committed to it is because the kinds of examples that are given of hinges, they seem like such an heterogeneous class. You know, they range from things like, you know, I've got two hands, to speaking English, to Great Britain is Ireland, I've got parents and so on. They look like, well, they don't seem to have much commonality to them. Okay, so, my alternative view. So here's some desiderata when we think about hinges. Or so says on a hinge. So I think we should concede that the hinge commitments don't amount to rationally grounded knowledge. That leaves open, maybe there might be knowledge in some brute sense. I think that's probably not much of a live option, but it's an option anyway. But the key thing is whether or not they're rationally grounded knowledge, that's what's key. Here's a more controversial claim. I don't think our hinge commitments, given the way we've described them, can be thought of as knowledge-active beliefs. Now what I mean by that is that the notion of belief is a very flexible notion. People mean lots of different things by it. But I want to focus on a particular kind of notion of belief, which is used by epistemologists, which is the notion that's in play when we think of it as a constituent of knowing. And I think here, believing is believing something to be true, and this kind of believing has essential connections. It's responsive in certain important ways to rational considerations. You know, this kind of belief, one can't be in this kind of state, for example. One can't recognise one has no reason to think that P is true and continue to be in a state of believing P. I mean, the state that one has then is something else, like a wishful thinking or something like that, but it's not a believing. Because a believing is the kind of thing, it's not that there can't be irrational beliefs, but it's just the kind of thing which is in principle responsive to rational considerations. Because that's what it is, it's believing it to be true, therefore it's responsive in certain ways to reasons and evidence. And given the way we describe hinge commitments, they're not like that. Remember what Wittgenstein says, they're not acquired through rational processes, we swallow them down with everything else that we're taught. And they're not, at least not directly, responsive to rational processes either. You know, we don't offer, they don't have reasons in their support, and reasons can't be offered against them either. They're not rationally evaluated at all, they're immune to rational evaluation. So that's what I mean when I say they're not beliefs. If you want, you can just insert they're not knowledge-act beliefs. If you want to have a broader notion of belief. Here's a key thing though, insofar as they are, insofar as we think of the hinge commitments as propositional attitudes, I think we should, then they have to be agnosticism, incompatible agnosticism about the target proposition. If you remember I mentioned Wright's view earlier about entitlement. Without going into the details, one of the reasons why his view gets all tangled up is because he wants to say that he wants a view on which one can recognise that one doesn't have a reason to believe that P why he continues to be committed to P in virtue of other considerations. And he realises, rightly, that you can't think of the relevant attitude here as being belief now. So he gets that point right. But then he tries to substitute other kinds of states in there, like trustings, acceptings, and so on. But they don't really serve the role they need to play, because these kinds of states are compatible with agnosticism about P. And you can trust that P, but be agnostic about whether P. But what we want from a hinge commitment is not that kind of thing. It's an all-out commitment to P. It's not compatible with agnosticism about P. So the wrong kind of attitude gets picked out and right to P. Yes. The other thing I want to say about this is, for those of you who know this lecture, I don't think there are aleaphs either. Yeah, to Mark Enbrand, this great paper on aleaphs. So, aleaphs are distinct from. So, there's a bit of literature now on aleaphs, but the original idea I take about aleaphs, they're kinds of things you might get, for example, when you're acrophobic, so you're scared of heights. So you might be perfectly aware that you're not in danger. So you judge that you're not in danger. You believe that you're not in danger, but you're scared nonetheless. So you alleve that you are in danger. Right? So there's these kind of like sort of visceral sort of commitments that we make, that we have in certain cases. I don't think that's the right way to think about hinges, because of course aleaphs, at least the standard examples anyway, they're meant to be in conflict with our beliefs, or they can be in conflict with our beliefs. Because hinges, by their nature, they're in conflict with our beliefs. Right? I mean, they're cornerstones of the things that we accept. So okay, so we've got a. So the idea is now on the non-belief view. So I suppose this is, you can think of the non-propositional view as a more extreme version of this. That gets rid of the propositional attitude at all. Here you do have a kind of propositional attitude, just not think of it as an object belief, but is one which excludes agnosticism. And in particular, we're not to think of it as the kind of propositional attitude which is either directly the result of rational processes or directly responsive to rational situations. I'll come on to this word directly and what it's doing there in a moment. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that you can deal with the closure problem pretty straightforwardly, I think, on this view. So think back to closure and how it was formulated. There we go. Remember I said it's not an incidental fact about closure that it's formulated in this diachronic way. Because it's trying to capture this idea that competent deductions from rationally grounded knowledge it can't lead to anything worse than what went in, as it were. You've got this paradigm case of a rational process, and you've got rationally grounded knowledge going in, then what comes out can't be any worse off, rationally speaking. So you need to formulate it like this to get that across, right? You've got to do it diachronically, you've got to have the belief formed on the basis of the competent deduction, that's crucial. Because it's diachronic, you've got to keep the knowledge fixed of the antecedent throughout, and so forth. So once you've captured that idea in this way, well then you've got something which really looks like it needs to be defended at all costs. But now think about the non-belief reading and how it plays out as regards that. Clearly the closure principle so formulated is simply going to be inapplicable to our hinge commitments. In fact, on two grounds it's inapplicable. First, inapplicable because there is no sense to the idea that we could believe our hinge commitments, much less believe them, secondly, on the basis of a rational process like competent deduction. So the thought is, once we properly understand what closure is, and we properly understand what hinge commitments are, then the closure problem doesn't get any purchase. There's no sense to the idea that we could go through a rational process and thereby acquire a belief in a hinge commitment. So that's the first thing to note. But I think we've still got this worry that, even on the non-belief read, well, why can't there be wide variation in the sort of hinge commitments that we have? I mean, on the face of it, there do seem to be the variation. I mean, take the example of been to the moon. When Moore came up with that example, very plausible hinge, at some point in the future it will cease to be such a plausible hinge. You know, if Richard Branson gets this space thing going in the desert, you know, eventually, then maybe the kind of thing where he got to the moon is maybe up into the moon, I don't know. So I think what we want to say about this variation Most views about hinges embrace the variation, the Williams type view. So you have this wide variation in the. So you take it at face value, there really is variation in hinges, and that can manifest in different people's hinge commitments. I think that's a mistake, because once you start to reflect on what is the common core to hinges, you realise it's pretty straightforward, actually. It's what I call the uber hinge commitment. It's this idea that we're not radically and fundamentally mistaken in our beliefs. I mean, that's what they express, right? That I've got two hands manifests the fact that I can't be radically and fundamentally mistaken in my beliefs. It's just a consequence of that general commitment that I'm committed to have a hinge commitment to the fact that I've got two hands. So we end up with a view which is, not only are they not optional, but there are actually limits on to the extent to which we have widely different hinge commitments. That is, the differences become superficial rather than fundamental. I'll explain what I mean by that. Note too, by the way, you know, that the plausibility of the idea, you know, when we say that it's a surprising fact, or it can seem at first a surprising fact, that a belief like I've got two hands is immune to rational evaluation. But it's not, I don't think it is quite so surprising to think that something like I'm not radically and fundamentally mistaken in my beliefs, that is immune to rational evaluation. That's fairly plausible. Right? How would one go about rational evaluating a belief like that? But if you think that the latter is just a manifestation of the former, well, then you've got a sort of explanatory connection. No wonder then this kind of things aren't rationally valuable. It's because they're manifesting this more general uber hinge commitment. And I think actually you end up with a taxonomy of hinge commitment. So you've got this overarching hinge commitment, which manifests itself in the personal hinge commitment. You know, one's not radically and fundamentally mistaken, well that manifests that in the fact that you've got two hands. How it manifests itself though will differ depending upon your beliefs and therefore on your actual circumstances. You know, if there was a community out there where everyone had three hands, then it may be that the one has three hands is the kind of hinge commit that the one swallows down with everything one's taught, not the two hands. But that doesn't reveal anything interestingly different about the two epistemic communities. It's not that they're employing radically different epistemic systems or anything like that, epistemic principles. All it really shows us is just that, well, just a simple factual difference.
What's a biv? Or is it a div?
Oh, sorry?
What's a biv?
Oh, sorry. Brain in a vat, sorry. So it's just a skeptical hypothesis, are you a brain in a vat? So, yeah. So anti-skeptical hinge commitments are denials of skeptical hypotheses, like you might be a brain in a vat. Yeah, sort of presupposing that. I think another one, like the example I used earlier on, would be that the universe didn't come into existence 5 seconds ago. Right, that's a skeptical hypothesis. So, brain in a vat is another kind of skeptical hypothesis. Maybe you're not causally connected to the external world around you. Maybe you're floating about nutrients in failure experience. How do you know you're not in that substance? How do you know you're not a div? Brain in a vat. So, the personal hinge commitments manifest the uber hinge commitment. We also have these anti-skeptical hinge commitments. And what I mean by that is just commitments to the denials of skeptical hypotheses. Skeptical hypotheses, of course, are formulated precisely to call the uber hinge into question. So it's not surprising they stand in this relationship. It is perhaps more surprising that personal hinge commitments manifest the uber hinge commitment. There are some interesting questions here, actually, which I won't go into because it's quite complicated, about how these play out in closure type inferences, but I won't go into that. One thing I do want to say, though, is, remember I said before about how hinge commitments aren't directly responsive to rational considerations? Well, a little bit of a clarification there. So, of course, in one sense, they're indirectly rationally responsive. You know, if one starts to acquire a picture of the world in which people go to the moon regularly, then at some point, whether or not you've been to the moon will cease to be, that you've not been to the moon will cease to be a hinge commitment. So in that sense, it is responsive to rational consideration. But it does so indirectly in virtue of your body of beliefs changing, not in virtue of someone giving you reasons against the proposition qua hinge. Okay, well, I'm nearly done. So let's go on a bit. Okay, so then I think there's a different kind of metaphor which we can use when we think about the hinge metaphor maybe leads us astray to some extent. I mean, think about that metaphor. You move the hinges, the door starts opening in very different ways. It can open, open inwards, it can open upwards, and so on. And it's kind of up to you where you put the hinges. So it has kind of variability and optionality built into the metaphor. That's probably not the way to think about hinge commitments. They're more visceral than that. The optionality is not there. And in fact, variability is kind of surface. The hinge commitment, the thought goes, is common. Wittgenstein comes back to this idea again and again. In order to make a mistake, man was already judging conformity to mankind, some propositions, a form of empirical proposition, the hardened functions, channels, blah, blah, blah. So the thought here is that the change over time is essentially gradual. And I think there's a kind of naturalism in play here. You know, insofar as we have people who can make sense of one another at all, can talk to one another. Remember, we're presupposing that there's no truth relativism in play, no content relativism, meaning relativism. Well then, it follows that there probably will be overlaps in terms of the hinge commitments that we have. So this kind of picture doesn't invite that image of the variability of the hinges that you get with the Williams scheme. And I think this is the sense in which, if a Wittgensteinian epistemology can avoid the pernicious form of epistemic relativism, the one which is concerned with epistemic conventionality, that's how it would be done. Thanks very much. So there's a PowerPoint to this. Michaela, I've sent it. She can distribute it once. Anyone wants to, and I've got a bunch of literature there if anyone's interested. Thanks for listening. Sorry.